everyone. Welcome. This is Compliance at Scale, the hub and spoke model. Definitely encourage everyone to come towards the front of the room if you can and want to. Have a nice intimate conversation. My name's Allie Hurt. I'll be moderating today's session. I work on technical accessibility and compliance strategy here at Microsoft. And I'm excited to guide this conversation with leaders who are building and operating these hub and spoke models in 3 different organizational contexts. So over the next 45 minutes, we'll explore how centralized hub teams set standards, create guidance, and measure progress, while distributed spoke teams drive implementation on the ground. This is a practitioner-oriented session, and so we hope you leave with practical insights into role definitions, operating rhythms, and interaction models that you can take back to your organizations. We do plan to have time for Q&A at the end, so please save any questions for our panelists until then. With that, I will let our 3 panelists introduce themselves. Jamie, would you please start off?
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Jamie Dean. I'm the lead counsel for accessibility regulation here at Microsoft, which means I work with the product teams to understand the laws that apply to our products and that relate to accessibility.
Hi, all. I'm April Chen. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm the Director of Responsible AI Measurement within the Office of Responsible AI at Microsoft. And what this means is I work really closely across our policy, research, and engineering orgs to understand, measure, and mitigate AI risks. And this is all towards the advancement of our goals in both AI safety and also regulatory compliance.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Lano, and I'm the Accessibility Program Director at Honeywell. So I lead our enablement programs for both our customer and employee experiences for disability inclusion. And I'm really thrilled to be here today. Thanks so much, Allie and team, for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming. We're so thrilled to have you. So these on the agenda, a few things that we'll go through today: hub and spoke model in action, translating policy into practice, accountability and advocacy, escalation paths, and Q&A. So we'll go ahead and dive in. April, we're so happy to have you here today from the Office of Responsible AI at Microsoft. As you may remember from the keynote, responsible AI is a trust domain at Microsoft and sits next to accessibility. So can you walk us through how your team functions as the hub, what you own centrally, what you push to product teams, and what are the roles and cadence that make it all work?
Yeah, definitely. So the Office of Responsible AI, our remit is to operationalize our AI principles. So these are fairness, inclusiveness, transparency, accountability, safety and reliability, and privacy and security across Microsoft. In practice, what this actually means is we establish the AI governance process, we define the roles and responsibilities, and then we also put in the procedures and controls to make sure that we're actually doing the things that we say we're doing. Examples of this mean we're defining the requirements that engineering teams need to meet. We're setting up the review processes for high-impact cases, and then we're also building and fostering the responsible AI champs community. So we own the bookends, we define the rules, and we define the receipts. In the middle, a lot of that work is distributed across product teams. So product teams are actually doing implementation of requirements. They're running evaluations. They're measuring our AI products to make sure that they're properly mitigating against any potential risks. But we also work across the entire responsible AI ecosystem. So not just internally, but also looking out and thinking about, what are the state-of-the-art practices that we can pull into our organization. And also, I think everyone knows this, AI is a very fast-moving space. So thinking ahead about some novel risks that we need to account for now.
Thank you. And Annie, you're here from Honeywell, one of Microsoft's customers, but very similar in that you have a huge global-wide scale, and you're also running a centralized accessibility program. I know that you built the formal accessibility program from the ground up about 2 years ago and are still building, as we all are. But can you tell a little bit about how you structured your hub and spokes across the enterprise? I know you have both cross-industry, cross-functional, kind of how you think about that in terms of key pillars of your program.
Yeah, absolutely. And firstly, and maybe just for some reference for those of you not familiar with Honeywell, we are a manufacturing engineering organization that follows 3 megatrends. So we create products that are in a lot of other organizations, ecosystems, and really help enable, I guess, the future of aviation. So we do a lot in the aerospace, defense and space, commercial aviation sector. We do a lot in manufacturing, in building management systems and fire life safety, and we also do a lot in industrial automation. And so when we started the program, and as Ali mentioned, we're about 2 years of the formal accessibility program at Honeywell. It was initially similar to, I think, many people's experiences at companies, a grassroots effort to start through our disability employee network group, All Abilities. So me and several of my colleagues who were part of the disability community, and should have shared this in my intro, but I'm legally blind, so I identify as part of the community, and many others shared feedback with our executives. We were, trying to figure out how could we ensure a more collaborative and inclusive experience for our employees with disabilities. And so in doing that, we got really great feedback and very receptive leadership conversations where they were starting to integrate more accessible experiences into our own workspaces. So, started off small, easy things, closed captioning, interpreting in town halls, communications where we were starting to incorporate things like alternative text and just really trying to make it a more inclusive employee experience. And then from there, expanded it to our customer experience, actually starting off with hackathons where we would bring together our network and start thinking about how could we really influence this in our product space. So, again, we work in places where everyone works every day, and our goal is really to create a more resilient, safer, and reliable place for everyone, and that's a big part of our mission as Honeywell. And so with that, accessibility really fits right into that. And so we started thinking about this for the customer journey and built up kind of these 3 pillars of experience. So firstly, looking at physical and digital experiences. We looked at culture. So how do we create a culture where everyone feels included? And then lastly, looking also at how could we think about this from an innovative and tech standpoint with our customer first mindset. And so thinking about kind of those 3 areas, that's how we stood up our Accessibility Council. And about 2 years ago, we went public with our first accessibility statement, which was our leadership team's commitment to driving more of an inclusive workplace culture and customer experience for people with disabilities. And from there, what we really did is we identified who do we need in the room to help us operationalize this work at scale. So we identified key functional leaders who are part of the kind of those 3 strategic priorities around culture, experience, and product, and brought them into the conversation. I'm very fortunate to have a fantastic executive sponsor, Mike Stepniak. He's our CFO at Honeywell and has been very invested in the continued evolution of our program, and we meet really regularly to make sure that this is continuously aligned to our business priorities as an organization. But not only did we name people from different functions to be a part of this broader council, what we did is we created a shared responsibility and accountability model. So while I am the program director for accessibility, I'm thrilled to say I'm not doing it alone. I have some fantastic functional leaders who join me in this mission of really driving this inclusion into the work that we do at Honeywell. Today, we're at about 35 functional and regional leaders across our enterprise and growing. So, really excited about the journey we're on and, the evolution that this program will be taking.
Thank you. And I think accountability, which you just mentioned, also showed up in the keynote. That's definitely a key theme here. The hub cannot do it alone without the spokes. Grassroots efforts are great to get things started, but you really do need those accountability mechanisms in place in order to be able to scale your program, especially as things start to move faster in the age of AI. So great to see that commonality between our 2 companies.
Absolutely.
So Jamie, your model looks a little different. You're not managing a large champion network. You're essentially a 1-person accessibility legal hub. So how does the hub and spoke model work when you're a single subject matter expert who has to scale legal guidance across a massive organization like Microsoft?
Yeah. So audience participation moment. Are there any lawyers in the room? Oh, I see.
Oh,
Wow,
one.
okay. It's a safe space.
One.
This is how rooms always are for me.
Yeah.
So as the one member of the centralized accessibility legal team, I am the legal resource who's responsible for ingesting legal requirements and interpreting them. But my real role is empowering our product attorneys. They're the attorneys who are embedded with organizations like Experiences and Devices, who we heard from earlier today, or Office and Windows. They're the ones who are giving advice on the ground. So in my role, often because I have the expertise on accessibility, but they have the product and business expertise, I'm sort of parachuting in to help them solve a specific problem. Often it means I get to work really closely, not just with those product lawyers, but also with the engineering teams that are actually building the products, which I love. And then the other key piece, in addition to this kind of parachuting in role, is thinking about how do we scale our guidance so that those frontline product attorneys are able to, and are empowered to provide guidance on their own, so that the times that I have to parachute in are even fewer. So for me, it's really about being a catalyst, both for the product attorneys and then for the engineers that they're supporting.
So you mentioned parachuting into a spoke for specific questions or high-risk scenarios. Do you ever bring the learnings back to the hub? Are there times where you advise on an issue and that ends up resulting in an update to global guidance? Or how do you think about kind of the one-off questions in the spokes versus global guidance in the hubs?
Yeah, so for me, what I think about is we're experiencing an issue. Is it because of the application of the law? Is it because of the interpretation of the law? Or is it because of the way I have communicated about the law? And each of those can necessitate a change at the global level. So you think about application. Often it's like, all right, is this because your product actually wasn't contemplated by the law when it was created? This happens to us at Microsoft all the time because the law lags technology. I'm sure any of you who work in technology understand this phenomenon that you're looking at WCAG and you're saying, well, how does this exactly apply to a voice-driven co-pilot type interaction with multimodality? I also then look and say, well, because we're having this issue, maybe I interpreted the law wrong. And obviously, if I've interpreted it wrong, it does happen, Allie, from time to time. Then we're going to change the guidance, right? And then the last is, are we communicating this in a way that people understand? One of the ways that Allie and I work really closely together is she comes with an engineering background and I come with a legal background. There is a translation layer that is sometimes needed. And so if we have the right answer, and this is a situation that is likely going to repeat in the future, but we don't have the right communication form so that people understand and can implement what we're talking about, then we need to change. And so the other thing that just kind of brings to mind for me is that it's not just about giving people a great legal memo or a really clear requirement, but all of these other materials like Q&As and guidance documents and engineering implementation suggestions, they're all a part of this really critical ecosystem that stems out of legal.
Absolutely, and I'll be the first to admit that sometimes we think that our centralized guidance makes sense to product teams, and then we get feedback that it actually doesn't. So thinking through mechanisms that we can scale our support, but offer additional support to those spoke teams through things like office hours, through things like revising documentation, building co-pilot agents on top of kind of our centralized guidance and things like that. So always willing to take feedback from the spoke teams on how the hub teams are performing and the type of support and guidance that we're offering.
Gentle feedback.
Gentle. I didn't say we'd implement the feedback. I said we were willing to take it. So April, you're also in the legal division like Jamie and I here at Microsoft. You're not an attorney.
I am not.
Can you describe how the responsible AI team partners with attorneys and with product groups to make translation between regulations, standards, and product guidance happen? I know AI is obviously in a very different regulatory space than accessibility, so how do you manage?
Yeah, again, I'm not an attorney. I come from a technical background, so as a machine learning engineer, data scientist in a past life. So now I sit in a position where I am between these engineering orgs and also our in-house attorneys. And everything you've said so far resonates so much for our organization as well, because the work that we do is inherently cross-functional. I think everyone in this group can recognize that if you take regulatory text, that is not directly implementable by any product or engineering teams. So we have to do a lot of that translation. So a lot of what our team does is we partner very closely with our attorneys to translate, just very complex text, legal regulatory text across multiple jurisdictions, because Microsoft is a global company, and simplify it into very concrete requirements. But the requirements themselves are also still insufficient for implementation. So after we've done that first pass, we then work really closely with our engineering and product teams to take that concrete requirements and actually do another layer of translation into implementation guidance that's actually usable by those engineering teams. And then all together, we invest in a lot of the responsible AI infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, what I mean is engineering tooling, operational processes that we can then enable individual product teams to be able to apply these requirements and be able to generate the receipts that we actually need for our regulators and for our business. So it is very inherently cross-functional, and we are sitting across all these different domains.
So you mentioned cross-functional, you mentioned multiple domains. So we have responsible AI, we have accessibility. They each have their own centralized hub. How does that work? Like, how do you see the interaction? Jamie, I'll ask you, because I know you've been working on this recently. How do you see the interactions between responsible AI and accessibility in the hub? Do you work together? Are we just giving engineering groups separate guidance? How does that work?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a both and, because in this world, we're being put in the same context more than ever. So especially because of regulation in the European Union with the European Accessibility Act and now the EU AI Act with cross-referencing each other, we have a kind of a different level of connection. And then there's also new requirements in Europe around what's called the CE marking. It's really exciting stuff, but it basically means companies are asked to certify that they're compliant with the law. You have to do that for the European Accessibility Act for products that are in scope. You have to do that for the European AI Act for certain products. And so now suddenly these two areas that were siloed face the same ultimate requirement and have to meet a similar bar in order for our products to go to market. So in that way, we're kind of being forced together. And then I think there's also these really cool overlaps in how these maybe aren't even on the regulation side, but we're finding that engineers are using AI to comply more, right? They're using AI tools to build compliance. And we're finding that in the world of AI, this is a little bit of a tangent, but AI itself is becoming more of an assistive technology that indirectly impacts the compliance of our other products by giving people other ways of interacting. So I think this type of overlap has not been, hasn't always been there, but is organically growing more and more.
Yeah. So just to continue on the theme of AI, it wouldn't be a panel in 2026 if we didn't talk about using AI to become more efficient and scale. Jamie, can you tell me a little bit about some of your recent AI experiments to help scale your legal guidance, some of your vibe coding?
Yes. So one challenge that we had is when the European Accessibility Act rolled out, it only applies to a specific set of products and services. But the requirements that it has for those products and services are significant. I just mentioned the most significant one is you've got to certify compliance before you can put products on the market, which is a totally novel kind of accessibility regulation. So the biggest challenge then is figuring out, is my product or service in scope for the European Accessibility Act? And what that used to look like was us going and doing a PowerPoint presentation for a business group and saying what's in scope, and then individual product groups calling us and saying, well, here's my product, here's what it does, and it's 2 or 3 meetings and assessments of edge cases and all those things. And so what we did was took our guidance, put it into an M365 Copilot agent, and then deployed that. So what teams can do is get a first pass, emphasize first pass, on whether they're in scope for the European Accessibility Act, that then they can have an attorney review and confirm. And so we're using AI to shorten the cycle between when we have the issue arise and when we have an answer, and then to help teams earlier in the process understand what requirements are going to apply to them.
Awesome. It sounds like it must save you some time.
It saves me some time.
Some time. Awesome. Well, now we're going to transition a little bit to accountability and advocacy. Annie, I'll come back to you. You mentioned that you have a corporate accessibility council across your business, about 35 people. Can you talk a little bit about how often do you meet? What do you talk about? How do you manage that champions network?
Yeah, no, and I totally relate to both what Jamie and Errol are saying about needing to create content and resources that are really meeting people where they are, especially in a hub and spoke model. So for us, what we do is we meet regularly on a monthly basis with our council leaders. Those are the leaders that have been appointed in the different functions to help operationalize accessibility at scale. We also are right now in the process of standing up an ambassadors program that's a little bit lower level, where we can integrate accessibility into the teams, the environments in which the work is being done. And so we meet, again, monthly as a leadership team. They act also as a governance for our policies and standards. So if there are exceptions or requirements needed to be reviewed, we can meet together and operate as a governing council together. We also meet biannually with our senior leadership and sponsor community. So I mentioned Mike in my previous points around how he's our executive sponsor and champion for the work that we're doing. And really, he hosts a biannual meeting where we as leaders come together, we highlight the program, the opportunities that we are still working on, the successes that we've shared together, and again, really try to create a community of shared responsibility and accountability.
Awesome. April, I want to ask you a little bit about the Responsible AI program. You actually have measurement in your title. So kind of how does that accountability mechanism work between you and your CHAMPS network? Is that something that they share some of the accountability for, and kind of how do you measure that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So measurement is my role. I love metrics. So for us, measurement is a key part of our Responsible AI program. And the way I see measurement is it's an accountability and transparency principle. So it's a mechanism for us to be able to say, are we doing in practice what we want to be doing? And what this means is we want to be able to measure our models and our systems for their capabilities, for quality, for safety, for compliance. And this is something that we do broadly. So we have a central hub, so a review process, in which any AI product prior to release is actually going through this process where we have stakeholders, decision makers, who actually go through these metrics and say, is this meeting our bar for safety, our bar for compliance? And if it is not, this is actually a deployment blocking process until those issues get resolved. So it is a huge part of our program, and a lot of my job is then working really closely with engineering to then actually leverage AI to build a lot of this engineering tooling so that we can create these metrics in an automated way, because there are hundreds of deployments per year, and we can't individually be able to do this without this kind of technology.
Now, you mentioned a centralized process. You mentioned deployment blocking. I'm sure many of us who work in compliance or governance have seen compliance framed as a cost center or a prevention of progress or productization. How do you reframe it, April, as a value driver when you're talking to business leaders who might not really be familiar with the value of compliance?
This is becoming somewhat of a theme even in the keynotes. I think accessibility is important, safety is important, and we have to do this for compliance. But even without any kind of mandates, we should still be upholding these standards. If we think about safety, if we think about accessibility, these are basic good product practices that build customer trust. And the way I would reframe it is trust itself is a market differentiator.
Annie, is that something you've encountered at Honeywell?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think accessibility, compliance leads the market, and it's the, I think I heard it in the keynote, and I think it was well said. It's the baseline. This is the foundation of the work that, is just basic access, but the opportunity for inclusive and universal design is a really big, I think, opportunity space, and that's something that we're definitely looking at Honeywell with both our products and our employee experiences as well.
That's great. All right, let's shift gears again. We're going to talk about pressure testing the model. This all sounds well and good, but we all know that things don't go according to plan 100% of time. So, Jamie, let's talk about the real world. We have a hypothetical new product that's approaching launch, and they tell us that they're not going to meet 100% of requirements. How do you think through that? Like, kind of what factors do you consider as part of that discussion with the product group?
Yeah, don't I wish I could say I'd never had to think about this before in my entire life. You've really caught me flat-footed here. Well, I'm just going to start with where April and Annie were already going, which is there's these different dimensions of risk that we face, right? But the first and most important question to ask is, how is this issue going to impact a user? Right? How is the customer with a disability going to be affected by this issue? And then the other two important domains are, what's the legal risk, right? Is this a situation where we're going to be required to report this noncompliance, or could we be sued over it, or could there be an investigation by the FCC or another regulator? And then what's the engineering risk, or the engineering lift and timeline to address the issue? I think in these moments of it always feels like a crisis when these comes up and you're preventing someone from going to general availability. I think it's really critical for the hub to become a mini product manager just for the moment, to get everybody aligned on what the interests are and what the steps are for going forward. Because what I think is the secret risk that lawyers don't always see is time. And so the more time we spend chewing on the problem, it just continues to get worse, right? And so it's really critical for the hub role to get everyone on the same page, to get a strategy, and even if it's imperfect, to move forward in a timely way, because that's the best way to serve our customers. It's also the best way to mitigate our risk.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore what you said about user impact. I think that's something that we're increasingly trying to work with the spoke teams on understanding, coming to that shared understanding in the hub. This is what the issue is, potential risk, and this is what the user, this is the impact to the user, because ultimately that's what we need to care about. So that's something that hasn't always been the case with our hub relationships with the spokes. It's been more like, well, here's a WCAG violation, 2.1.3, whatever. But increasingly, we're trying to talk about things not in terms of standards or bug level, but really, who does this impact and how?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the critical roles that your team plays is, I didn't say this earlier, but I'm also blind, so I get the user impact side of it, which is great to communicate with legal advice. But your team has folks who, this is really such a focus for them, is going to the engineers and saying, hey, let's sit down and watch how I interact with this and see how it goes. And that type of feedback, it's worth like 10,000 attorney words or more, right? 5 minutes with a user, it just communicates so much more on the human level. And drives the desire to comply, as opposed to the attorney coming in and saying, we just have to do this because we have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the great point. That's a great point. I do find that when I go in and talk to product teams, people, and help them understand why we have these requirements, people do want to do the right thing. And so really having that grassroots layer of people that understand accessibility and the user scenarios, along with that C-level or higher executive sponsorship, really helps get things done in the end.
Absolutely.
So April, I know responsible AI has incident reporting mechanisms, both external facing and internal. So can you talk a little bit how issues might be flagged at the spoke level? Do they come directly to you to triage? Is there something that happens in the spoke? Who's the right decision maker there?
Yeah, I already alluded to this a little bit, but we have something called the Deployment Safety Board. So this is a central group that can vote for whether or not a product can be deployed, and this is for any AI product. So again, I had mentioned measurement, but once we do measurement on the capabilities, quality, safety, and compliance of our products, they bring these metrics to this board. This board actually reviews all these metrics for a given product, and then they make a determination, a vote for whether or not it is ready for deployment or not ready for deployment. And then they work really closely with that team to figure out what they need in order to meet those requirements. And I think one of the things that we're really moving towards, and I think this is not just within responsible AI, but more generally is this really close iterative feedback loop between policy and implementation. So a lot of that work is ongoing. So this is a way for us to actually surface a lot of these issues from the spoke to the hub so that we can make these kinds of decisions together. And then post-deployment, there's no way for us to avoid every single risk. It happens. So we do, in a post-deployment setting, have a incidents reporting and response process where both internally and externally folks can raise issues, and then we have a process in which there's remediation for the product team owners.
And with the pace of AI, talking about how many AI deployments are happening at Microsoft every day, is every AI deployment treated the same, or are there some that are higher risk than others and maybe treated differently?
Yeah, so no, definitely not. We do have a triaging process in which, depending on the deployment scenario, who are the end users, whether it's general availability, how many end users are using it, the potential risks and impacts of a given deployment, they would be all treated quite differently. And especially those very high impact, high risk cases, there is definitely a group that handles them with care. And then we also apply additional mitigations for those cases.
Okay, I like that. So you have the standard hub process, but then there's an even more kind of white glove for the really special sensitive use cases.
Exactly.
That makes sense. Now we'll talk a little bit about everyone's favorite subject, procurement. Annie, you mentioned that as the hub, you can't be in every single contract negotiator with a supplier, certainly at Honeywell, as we cannot at Microsoft. So when a spoke encounters a situation that they can't resolve or don't know what to do with, kind of maybe a supplier who can't meet your accessibility bar, like what does that escalation path look like? Does that always come to you, or do the spokes occasionally resolve that themselves?
Yeah, and this is, I think, consistent with all of our functional partners, is creating, information and translating, I think, the WCAG, the guidelines, the requirements to the levels of where they are in their space and how it's applicable to them. So I know Jamie and April talked a little bit about what you guys do at Microsoft. We do the same thing. So we've created an accessibility portal that helps our employees really understand what those requirements look like for them. So creating things like toolkits, resources, help, and escalation paths to get the resources and tools they need to manage those situations within their respective functions is something we've done a lot of work to build around. But in addition to that, we have to meet people where they are. So I partner very closely with some of my procurement partners, as an example, with procurement, to really understand what does the day-to-day look like for them? If you're a contract manager, what does the process look like to negotiating a new vendor and supplier contract? What are some of the ways in which we're already evaluating that product, and how can we integrate accessibility into the work that the teams are already doing and building in their space? So while we have a central hub for accessibility, we're working to integrate it more holistically into the spaces in which people are actually operating and transacting in their day-to-day. So as an example with procurement, we have rolled out a requirement for our suppliers to meet certain accessibility requirements, and we've built out playbooks that they can reference in our hub portal, but additionally, we've built in specific checklists and requirements into our RFP process, into our vendor assessment process, and then given them links and tools in their own workspaces to really access information specific to that workflow.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we're seeing too as we think about building out tooling and checklists and checkpoints and things like that for accessibility. There's so many different tools and so many different processes. You really do have to meet people where they're at. You can't just hope that you're going to get everyone through the golden path all the time when you're working at companies the size of Honeywell and Microsoft. So great point. Thank you. Well, we are approaching our last 10 minutes, which will be Q&A. So I'd like to close the discussion with a lightning round. If you could give every person in this room one piece of concrete advice for scaling compliance in their organization, what would it be? April, I'll start with you.
Sure. I would say just simplify as much as possible. especially as the central policy and governance group. We need to take ownership of absorbing the complexity, the ambiguity of legal and regulatory requirements across jurisdictions. So the guidance we're actually handing to product teams are clear, are practical, and are actually implementable.
Yep, we hear that in accessibility too. Make it simple, make it understandable. Absolutely. All right, Jamie?
I would say, and maybe this is a little directed at lawyers, so if you're not a lawyer, go home and tell your lawyer this. Be a problem fixer, not a problem finder. Coming into these conversations with the mindset of here's how you can instead of here's why you can't makes a huge difference in how you're received in a room. I want people to be glad I'm there. I want them to see me as a productive partner, and I want them to feel excited about accessibility compliance, which means I have to be a person who's partnering with them and solving problems, not just telling them that the problem is there.
I love that. And Annie, how about you?
So I think very similar to both Jamie and April, it's meeting people where they are, understanding not everyone is an accessibility expert and isn't paid to be. So making sure that it's easy and understandable for them to take that broad principle, that work forward, and integrate it into what they're doing, I think is a really important part of the hub in the understanding the spoke model.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We have time for Q&A now. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? I think we do have some mic runners too. A couple of questions. Hi there.
Hi, Allie, it's Christian.
Hi, Christian.
Hi. My question is for Jamie. Jamie, I work for Salesforce, so we're making only B2B products. And, one of the, many years ago, we were big supporters of Senator Duckworth's legislation that she was introducing, the Software Application Accessibility Act. Unfortunately, that didn't fully get introduced even for a vote. But the laws basically say what our customers do with our products has to be accessible, whether it's for their customers or for their employees. But there's no law that says anything that we build has to be accessible.
Yeah.
And I feel like if we had such a law, right, maybe we all work ourselves out of a job, which would be amazing. But at the same time, we want people building products that are accessible for the right reasons.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, Jamie, from your perspective as a lawyer, what your thoughts are on making such a law available, and then the advocacy towards that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so there's some optimism on the horizon that the law is evolving that direction. When I talk about law at Microsoft, I always try to explain that we are subject to two different kinds of laws. Direct obligations like the European Accessibility Act or the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. Those tell us, here's what you have to do with your product and service if you want to put it on the market. But that applies to technology companies like Microsoft and a few other industries. It's just not going to cover everybody. Indirect laws are exactly what Christian's talking about. It's like this is an obligation that your customer has to meet in order for them to go to market. I think that creating direct laws is in one way, it's really, you say, I want this because I think it'll be good for the community. And another way, as a member of the community, I say it's a little fraught because let's take Section 508, for example. I think Section 508, while it's a procurement law, it's standard that it's tied to is WCAG 2.0, right? Which is like decades old, right? So laws, once passed, they're great at setting a big obligation, but they're not great at saying exactly how to meet it. And so it's a real challenge, even when you bring advocates and lawmakers and industry in the room together, and they all have the same goals. It's really hard to settle on words that we can agree on and obligations that we can agree on. So I think that the other levers that we have to pull, other than just legislation, and also this is a hard time to pass legislation, in the US at least, it's not a great cooperative Congress, right? So we have to think about what are the other levers that we have to pull. I think the trust lever that has been talked about up here is really good. The sales lever is obviously really important, explaining like we can't sell this if it's not accessible. And then I think we have to use, our companies have to use their own muscle, right, as procurers of technology to say when we buy, we want it to be accessible as well. So I would love for the law to evolve and have a more direct explanation of what it means to be accessible and clearer obligations. But I think that that's happening in some places, but in general, I think these other levers are going to be the more effective ways to see change that actually keeps up with the pace of technology.
Allie, can I add a point to that really
Absolutely.
quick? So, I love what you said about the other levers to pull because, I think it was said, well, like compliance is the baseline. What we've done at Honeywell, and maybe this will help other B2B companies think about this in just a different perspective. So if our products are inaccessible and we sell it to another company, that means that they can't hire people with disabilities, or they're having to pay for other companies to accommodate and create other systems for people with disabilities to access their work. And so I think that's a really important point that gets lost in this conversation, because while legislation is mostly consumer facing, we all create the environment to create disability inclusion in the workplace. And so I think when we're having these conversations with leaderships in our own respective companies and we're thinking about how can we scale these programs, especially as B2B, that's a big part of the conversation that I don't think is often talked about. How the B2B part of the discussion really plays a big part in the global ecosystem of disability inclusion.
That's a great point.
Thank you. I think we had another question right over here.
Hi, my name is Amy, and I'm from a local community college, so in higher ed. I don't know if anyone else here is in higher ed. So slightly different perspective, but I think this is mostly for April, maybe for Jamie. But I'm in charge of digital accessibility on our campus, and there's so many, all these great AI tools you're sharing, they're wonderful, but how am I able to reassure very firmly that the student data is safe? Because we have that tension between FERPA and student data, and so, if faculty want to upload a paper into Copilot for whatever reason, how can I tell them that that data is safe and we're complying with FERPA?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think it's a common concern for folks using AI. I know we touched on responsible AI and accessibility, but another huge trust domain that we work very closely with within our broader trust org is privacy. So when we talk about co-creating policies and implementation, privacy is a huge part of the group that we work very closely with. So the way we work really closely together is, for example, we on the AI side have a good understanding of privacy-related risk. The privacy groups are really the subject matter experts in terms of what are the legal and regulatory requirements around privacy. And when we're creating our own internal policies, we are ensuring that, one, we're meeting legal obligations, but in the same way we have responsible AI principles, we're also upholding our privacy principles alongside our responsible AI principles when we're rolling out our products as well.
And I think that really, that's the trust umbrella that we're talking about. That's what Microsoft is working really hard to build, and to hope that it is a sales differentiator, because we can ensure that cross-domain trust. So. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, yes, Fer.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Fer. How do you add redundancy to your compliance programs so that it remains intact when people go on vacations, change teams, change companies?
So I think, Annie, you talked about this specifically, kind of as you're building your program from the ground up. Do you have anything to add there about kind of redundancy?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have created at Honeywell what we call our global design models. It's our accelerator program. And essentially, it's if Annie Lano won the lottery tomorrow, what would we do to ensure that the work continues? So what we've done is we've created a system of really, operating systems. We've created standard documents, standard procedures, so someone could just come in and pick up the work. And what we've tried to do is make it integrated holistically into where, I mentioned this earlier, where people are. So for instance, if we have our procurement team using a specific tool set or they're using a specific system of record, it's integrated there. And then what we do is we have a succession planning model for our council. So in the event someone, again, were to win the lottery or find another opportunity within the company or elsewhere, the work would be sustainable as well.
And then I just want to add a little bit more to that. I think the way we have designed the program, I think there's almost two components. There's the organizational structure component, and then there's the culture component. So within the organizational structure component, we do have existing roles and responsibilities, so a dedicated role for executive sponsorship. We have our champs community, which includes dedicated roles for ownership of operationalizing our responsible AI principles and localized roles for embedding into product teams. And then there's also the culture element, right? So this is our forums for communication, our forums for support, and a lot of education, training, and upskilling across the company that we have to be actively a part of on the day-to-day basis as well.
And for us, I'm still working on cloning Jamie, but it is a work in progress. So, all right, well, we are out of time. I want to say thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to all of you for your time and attention and questions. Enjoy the rest of Summit.